February 1755, the English general Edward Braddock landed at the port of Alexandria with 1,000 British regulars. Braddock's expedition was just one part of a massive British offensive against the French in North America that summer. Braddock's mission was to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne, what's now Pittsburgh, and to destroy French resistance along the entire frontier. Now, General Braddock features prominently in my new book, History's 10 Worst Generals. So let's see why. And let's see if you can identify the elements of leadership failure that lead to disaster. Let's consider Braddock and his actions. Now, Braddock was commissioned into the elite Coldstream Guards at the age of 15. And by the age of 59, he had reached the rank of Major General. He was an able organizer and administrator, but despite a lifetime in the Army, he had never been in combat. Braddock's immediate problem on arriving in America was to recruit, train, and organize a combined Anglo-American force made up of British regulars, American militia units, and Indians. He did this, proceeding to put together a very credible European-style army. He placed his complete reliance on the notion of superior firepower that he thought he could bring to bear under any circumstances by traditionally proven means. Braddock's lack of actual field experience blinded him to how terrain could impact on the effectiveness of his tactics. Now, some locals, including Benjamin Franklin, who was helping to provision the army, cautioned the general about over-reliance on traditional methods. Franklin told the general that he feared that the ambushes were going to be laid by the Indians. Now, according to Franklin, the general said, General Braddock smiled at my ignorance and replied, "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression." The British looked down on America as a wilderness inhabited by a motley mix of renegades, malcontents, criminals, slaves, and Indians, unable to produce manufactured goods for itself, and culturally primitive. Appointed commissary of the Virginia militia in 1755, John Carlisle of Alexandria had a close view of the British attitude and complained that the British troops under General Braddock, by some means or another, came in so prejudiced against us and our country that they used us like an enemy country and took everything they wanted and paid nothing or very little for it. And when complaints were made to the commanding officers, they cursed the country and inhabitants, calling us the spawn of convicts, the sweepings of the jails, which made their company very disagreeable. So you can see Braddock wasn't making any friends among the locals. Now, General Braddock had even less use for the Native Americans who were to be used as scouts for the army. When one of the leading native chieftains asked Braddock what would become of the land once the French were pushed out, Braddock replied, "The English should inhabit and inherit the land." Well, when the chief told Braddock that the Indians would not fight for the British if they did not have liberty to live on the land that they would fight for, Braddock responded that he would drive the French away without their help. Most of the local Indians then walked away. Only 8 Native American scouts accompanied the column, and they did so very reluctantly. Now, General Braddock failed to consider that the protection and survival of the column relied upon its scouts and reconnaissance capability, and not solely on firepower. He led his force of regulars and militia, some 2,400 men, into the rugged wilds of western Pennsylvania in a narrow, slow-moving column. And he had imperfect knowledge of the terrain and scant intelligence of the French and Indians that they might find along the way. By early summer, Braddock's army had made its way from Alexandria to Cumberland, Maryland. And on the morning of June the 6th, 1755, Braddock's column set out from Cumberland on the great expedition against Fort Duquesne. The column at this point included 29 artillery pieces, 300 supply wagons, and 3,000 horses. This was the largest army ever seen in North America until that time. Well, unfortunately, General Braddock could never get used to the terrain and distances in America. The expedition faced an enormous logistical challenge. It had to move a large body of men, equipment, and heavy artillery across densely wooded and mountainous terrain, 110 miles into western Pennsylvania. As it turned out, the only way forward was to build a 12-foot wide road across the wilderness as the army moved. The going was very slow. Some days the column only covered 2 miles. By June 18th, Braddock realized that this slow progress would exhaust his supplies long before he reached his objective. He decided to divide his force. The best troops, some 1,400 men, including most of the British regulars, some of the horses, and a limited number of artillery pieces, would push ahead quickly, while the rest of the army brought up the majority of the artillery and the supply train. Now, Braddock reckoned that he could quickly reach and besiege Fort Duquesne with his infantry, preventing the French from reinforcing the fort. Then the bulk of his artillery would arrive and shatter the wooden stockade walls. It wasn't a bad plan on paper, but it broke down in practice. Suffering from dysentery, fevers, and exhaustion, and almost out of supplies, Braddock's troops viewed Fort Duquesne around midday on July the 9th as they crossed the Monongahela River. The column crossed with flags flying and drums beating. Braddock intended to intimidate the French. The resistance the British expected did not materialize. This lack of enemy activity only reinforced Braddock's belief in his strategy and arrangements. The elementary precautions he had scrupulously observed earlier in the campaign, he now slackened. Earlier in the campaign, Braddock ordered that the high ground be secured in order to prevent any surprise attack from the French and Indians. But lack of direct contact with the enemy lulled Braddock into a false sense of security. He did not secure the last rise after his forces crossed the Monongahela River, assuming the French had abandoned the fort. Such, however, was not the case. Although Braddock knew nothing of the French and Indian strength or intention, the enemy knew exactly the size, location, and line of march of Braddock's forces. The crashing trees, the cooking fires, and the noise of the wagons gave an exact report of Braddock's progress and location. We have a clip now from western Pennsylvania that tells what happened next. Braddock's army continued to fire volleys into the trees, and the volume of their fire kept the enemy from closing on the column for several hours. But an important part of the French strategy was the targeting of British officers. Prominent on their horses and standing out in their distinctive uniforms, the officers made easy targets. As losses among the officers mounted, panic began to spread among the ranks. The troops could not maneuver to fire, nor could they maintain their order once the officers were killed or wounded. American colonial troops sought cover, but Braddock saw this as cowardice and beat some of the Americans with the flat of his sword to drive them back into formation. Officers kept trying to reform units into regular order along the road. Cannon were used, but were ineffective in the deep woods. The colonial militia took up cover in the woods and returned fire, but were often shot in the confusion by the British regulars who mistook them for the enemy. Braddock and his few remaining officers, including George Washington, an honorary aide-de-camp, tried to organize counterattacks, but to no avail. After several hours of intense combat, and after having had 4 horses shot out from under him, Braddock suffered a shot through the arm that lodged in his chest. Braddock's wounding was decisive to the battle. With Braddock down and some 73% of the officers killed or wounded, the army simply disintegrated. The French and Indians swarmed along the road, seizing the artillery and wagons and killing and scalping the dying and wounded. The survivors trampled one another, scrambling to recross the river. The French and Indians, fortunately, lost interest in pursuit and began securing loot from the dead and the dying. George Washington, even though he had no official position in the chain of command, was able to impose and maintain some order and formed a rear guard, which allowed the remnants of the force to disengage. Of the approximately 1,400 men Braddock had led into battle, 456 were killed, 422 were wounded. The French reported 8 killed and 4 wounded. Their Indian allies lost 15 killed and 12 wounded. Braddock died on the night of July the 13th, 1755. His final words, "Who would have thought it?" We have a clip now that explains what happened next. George Washington and General Braddock had a close relationship. Washington looked up to Braddock as a father figure. George Washington and General Braddock feature prominently in the Archibald Mercer colonial detective book called the Stolen Sash. But General Braddock has also inspired other such stories. One of Northern Virginia's most intriguing legends involves General Braddock's lost treasure. Arriving at the village of Newgate, renamed Centerville in 1798, only 27 miles from Alexandria, according to the legend, the cannons and wagons became hopelessly mired in mud and clay. In an act of desperation, Braddock supposedly ordered some of the artillery buried. Taking aside a small group of soldiers, he buried 2 of the brass cannons after pouring the gold coins used to pay the troops into the open ends of the barrels. The mouths of the cannons were then sealed with wooden plugs. The general carefully noted the location of the treasure. 50 paces east of a spring where the road runs north and south. The road of which he spoke is now called Route 29-11, and it's in Centerville, Virginia. You can go there today and drive along that very road. Braddock marched on to disaster in western Pennsylvania, as we have seen, and according to the legend, his papers were sent to England. Years later, an archivist supposedly found the account of the buried gold located in Virginia, and a special committee was sent out by the British Parliament to search for the gold, but returned to England empty-handed. So to this day, 2 brass cannons filled with gold lie beneath the soil of Virginia. So here you have the legend of Braddocks Gold. But where did it come from? And how true is it? In 1982, Douglas Phillips and Barnaby Nygren wrote a monograph entitled An Inquiry into the Validity of the Legend of Braddocks Gold in Northern Virginia. Phillips and Nygren assert that they were unable to find any reference to General Braddock's treasure dating before 1954, when an article called A Buried Treasure by Charles J. Gillis appeared in the 1954 yearbook of the Historical Society of Fairfax County. The popular media was quick to take up the Gillis article, and numerous newspaper articles and book chapters have flowed from this original source. Problematically, the Gillis article cited no references. The Historical Society commentary on the Gillis article at the time said, Mr. Gillis is a lifelong resident of Prince William County. Legends such as this are a most delightful part of our history. When Phillips and Nygren compared historical documents to the Gillis account, red flags went up. The Gillis account, in many of its details, was not borne out by Braddock's own orderly books or accounts of the time by his officers. Actually, the Army seems to have made good marching time and encountered no inclement weather. In short, there is no evidence to suggest that any difficulties were encountered where the legend suggests the gold is buried. Phillips and Nygren next mapped out Braddock's line of march based on documents of the time, demonstrating that the column came nowhere near Centerville. They say all the first-hand accounts based on diaries, orderly books, letters, maps, and court records show that not only are certain elements of the legend probably false, but also that Braddock's troops took a march route which never brought them within 10 miles of Centerville. Phillips and Nygren conclude, while it is obvious to the authors that the probability of Braddocks Gold being buried in Fairfax County is virtually nil, the possibility, small as it may be, of gold being buried elsewhere along Braddock's route does exist. And that may be the source of the Northern Virginia legend, which brings us to an interesting treasure legend from the North Huntington Township website. It's located in western Pennsylvania. According to the website, during the time of his expedition into North Huntington area, General Braddock camped one evening with his army near what is now known as Circleville. Braddock requested that the men wait until after the battle to get paid because a number of them might be killed. Therefore, he reasoned that there would be fewer men to divide the gold. The men favored Braddock's plan. Braddock suggested that the gold be distributed after the battle, lest the French and Indian capture it. And so the legend lives on another day, now supposedly located in western Pennsylvania.